Breaking: Russia has reportedly captured Gulyaypole, and what's almost more shocking than the claim itself is how quiet the reaction has been. No dramatic emergency summit, no wall-to-wall headlines, just a few careful statements, and then silence. But here's the uncomfortable truth: wars aren't always decided by the cities you recognize on a map. Sometimes they're decided by places you've never heard of. Small towns that don't trend, but still control routes, buffers, and pressure points. And Gulyaypole fits that pattern perfectly. If you want clear, no-hype battlefield analysis like this, consider subscribing, because what's happening here doesn't look like a cinematic breakthrough. It looks like something slower, methodical, designed to change the front line 1 meter at a time, until it's too late to call it small. Gulyaypole is a small town in southern Ukraine, in the broader Zaporizhzhia direction. It's not a name you hear every day in international coverage, and that's exactly why it's useful to talk about, because towns like this often reveal the real mechanics of the war. In today's battlefield dynamics, a place like Gulyaypole matters less because of its population, and more because of what it sits near: the routes that connect supply points, the corridors that funnel reinforcements, and the buffer spaces that decide whether a front line is stable or constantly bleeding. And that's what makes this important. If Russia is pushing into Gulyaypole, it's not necessarily chasing a headline. It may be chasing something more valuable: operational control. Not a dramatic victory you see in one day, but a slow structural shift that forces Ukraine to defend more ground with the same or fewer resources. And before we even talk about the military map, we need to define something clearly. What does captured really mean in a town like this? When headlines say a town is captured, people imagine a sudden collapse, tanks rolling in, flags raised, a clean takeover. But in places like Gulyaypole, it rarely looks like that. Military maps over the last period have suggested Russian forces have been pressing into the area, but not through one dramatic strike. This isn't a lightning blitz. It's the kind of pressure Russia has used repeatedly since 2023. Step-by-step advances counted in blocks, tree lines, and intersections, moving only when the situation is prepared. And on the ground, there's another reality people forget. Once a town enters an active combat phase, civilian life doesn't continue. Civilians evacuate in waves, some through official channels, others leaving on their own. Whoever remains is usually a small group: older people, people without transport, or those who decided not to leave. So what you end up with is less a city and more a contested space: positions, ruins, routes, and firing angles. That's why a Russian entry into Gulyaypole matters. It can signal not a sudden win, but a long-running phase where Ukraine's local defense has been steadily weakened. And that weakening almost never happens overnight. It happens in the preparation phase. This didn't start with a single decision on a single morning. Before Russian units push deeper into a place like Gulyaypole, there's usually a long softening period, an ugly combination of pressure that's designed to drain defenses, disrupt coordination, and make the next step forward feel almost inevitable. First comes artillery pressure, not always one massive barrage, but repeated strikes that force defenders to relocate, stay underground, and burn through supplies. Then come reconnaissance drones, persistent eyes in the sky that map out movement, identify firing positions, and spot resupply routes the moment they become predictable. Alongside that is what you could call material disruption, targeting vehicles, depots, comms nodes, and anything that makes defense sustainable over time. The key point is patience. Rather than rushing into high-risk assaults where losses spike, the approach is often apply pressure, wait for cracks, then take ground when resistance is weaker. It's not fast, but it reduces surprise costs. And once the area is weakened enough, the next question becomes, what is Russia's actual objective after that? Because the most likely answer isn't the next big city, it's the space around it. If you look at this operationally, Russia may not immediately chase the next major city headline. A more realistic next step is expanding control over the surrounding villages and buffer zones. The smaller points that don't sound impressive but matter because they shape everything around them. Why? Because buffer zones protect your forward positions. They push Ukrainian forces farther back, reduce the angles from which counterattacks can be launched, and make it harder to hit logistics with short-range systems. They also widen the space where Russia can rotate troops, move ammo, and reposition artillery without being constantly exposed. So the objectives become practical: expand local control and stabilize the front-secure logistical routes, and safer movement corridors reduce the chances of a Ukrainian counter-thrust force Ukraine to spend resources defending territory meter by meter. And this is where the style of the fighting matters, because this isn't being done with Hollywood maneuvers. It's being done with a slow, methodical system, artillery, drones, small infantry movement, and constant consolidation. What's happening around places like Gulyaypole is not the kind of war that produces dramatic footage of massive tank waves and sweeping breakthroughs. Most of the time, it's the opposite. It's artillery, drones, and small infantry groups moving through broken terrain, probing for weak points, then repeating the process again and again until the defense line starts to thin. Tanks, when they appear, are often used less like spears and more like mobile fire support, covering movement, suppressing positions, and punishing anything that tries to relocate in daylight. And drones are central to the entire logic, not just as weapons, but as the nervous system of the assault. They scout, they spot, they correct artillery fire, they track rotations, they punish supply runs, they create a constant threat overhead that forces defenders to move slower, hide more, and communicate less. This style is dirty because it doesn't rely on clean, decisive battles. It relies on pressure. The goal is to reduce risk while increasing exhaustion on the other side. It forces Ukraine to spend personnel, ammo, and time defending every inch, because pulling back too fast creates openings, but holding too long bleeds strength. And once Russia takes a small piece of ground, the next move is often not to sprint forward. It's to lock it down, dig in, build positions, place obstacles, and bring artillery closer, so that the next push starts from a stronger base. Then, only after the position is stable, pressure shifts to the next sector. From far away, this can look like slow progress, but in a long war, slow progress can be the most dangerous kind. In a long war, the most important weapon isn't always speed, it's stability. A slow, disciplined approach can work because it reduces the chance of sudden disaster. Instead of gambling everything on one massive offensive, it spreads the fighting across time, turning each day into a small test of endurance. That makes it harder for the defending side to reset because pressure never fully stops. There's also a psychological layer: constant drones overhead, constant artillery risk, constant uncertainty about where the next push will land. Even if a defender holds, the cost of holding accumulates, and structurally, incremental gains are easier to keep. When ground is taken step by step and immediately fortified, it becomes expensive to reverse. That's why this can produce something that looks unimpressive on a map: small changes, slow movement, while still creating a strategic advantage over months. So when people ask, why does this matter? The answer is, it matters because this kind of war changes reality quietly. And that's exactly why the global reaction is so interesting. Because on this, the world has been unusually silent. What's striking about Gulyaypole isn't only what may be happening on the ground, it's how little noise it's making internationally. The United States and European governments continue to state support for Ukraine, but the messaging tends to be careful, strong on commitment, cautious on escalation. Military aid continues, but often framed in a more defensive or stabilizing way, rather than language that suggests a major shift in tempo. Ukraine, meanwhile, has its own reason to manage the narrative. In periods of heavy pressure, public messaging becomes part of defense, minimizing panic, avoiding the sense of a sudden collapse, and keeping attention focused on broader resilience rather than single location setbacks. When fronts are stretched, you don't want every local loss to become a national psychological event, and Russia's communication strategy fits this moment well. It doesn't always need big dramatic victories. The narrative can be simple: steady improvement, operations according to plan, small gains that create the impression of control and inevitability. That's why towns like Gulyaypole can be so useful. They don't have to be historic names. They don't have to be iconic battles. They just have to quietly demonstrate momentum, which leads to the deeper point. Gulyaypole may be less important as a headline, and more important as a symbol of what this war is becoming. Gulyaypole likely won't become a household name like Mariupol or Bakhmut, but that's the point, because it represents the kind of war that doesn't announce itself with one dramatic turning point. It advances through pressure, fatigue, and small structural advantages that accumulate until a front line simply looks different than it did months earlier. It's not fast, it's not cinematic, but it can be relentless. And if Russia is able to gain and hold ground here through methodical consolidation, it suggests a pattern, not a single decisive blow, but a steady process that forces Ukraine to keep spending scarce resources defending wider and wider lines. To understand why that pattern is sustainable, you have to look at what often decides long wars more than anything else: logistics. Because logistics isn't glamorous, but it's what makes slow pressure possible. One of the biggest reasons a slow, grinding approach can work is simple: supply. Russia often fights closer to its established logistical depth, meaning shorter routes for ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and troop rotation. Even when those routes are disrupted, the system is built to keep moving in some form. It may not be perfect, but in a long war, perfection isn't the requirement. Continuity is. That matters because artillery-heavy warfare eats resources. Shells, drones, batteries, repairs, transport, medical evacuation, everything becomes a daily consumption problem. A side that can keep feeding the machine, even at reduced efficiency, can maintain pressure longer than a side that experiences repeated interruptions. And logistics isn't only about physical supplies, it's also about managing units, rotations, rest, replacements, and keeping command structure intact under constant strain. So when you see incremental movement on the map, the real story might be happening behind the front. Which side can move resources reliably, which side can replace losses faster, and which side can keep the tempo steady without breaking. And this brings us to the forward-looking question. If this pattern holds, what happens next? If the pattern we're describing continues, the map won't change with one giant announcement. It will change quietly. More pressure on small towns, more buffer zones expanding, more positions taken, fortified, and used as launch pads for the next push. Not because each individual gain is huge, but because together they stretch Ukraine's defense, forcing choices about where to hold, where to rotate, and where to accept risk. And that's why the silence around places like Gulyaypole can be dangerous. It makes slow momentum feel like nothing, right up until it becomes something that's hard to reverse. The deeper lesson is that modern warfare doesn't always reward spectacle. It rewards tempo control, the ability to keep pressure consistent, deny recovery time, and turn small advantages into structural ones. So the real question isn't only whether Gulyaypole fell, it's whether this method becomes the new normal across the front. This video is created for educational and analytical purposes only. We do not celebrate violence, and we do not endorse harm against any side. The information discussed here is based on publicly available reporting, battlefield mapping, and geopolitical analysis, and it may evolve as new details emerge. Our goal is to help viewers understand how modern conflicts unfold, calmly, critically, and without sensationalism. We also believe that peace, dialogue, and diplomacy remain the best path to resolving any conflict, no matter how complex it becomes.